Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, let's learn a DevSecOps implementation, that is policy as code. Many of you might be hearing this term called as policy as code for the first time, but this is very important if you are implementing security in the DevOps practices of your organization. It's a very simple concept. We will also do a demonstration towards the end so that you will learn how to implement policy as code on the AWS platform. So please watch this video till the end so that you can learn the concept theoretically as well as practically. In this video, we will learn policy as code using three things: what, why, and how. So first, we will understand what is policy as code. Then we will learn why is policy as code important. And finally, we will learn how to implement policy as code. Let's start with what. If you leave policy as code aside for a while, what exactly is a policy? So policy in general words is nothing but a rule, and the rule is put in place for the purpose of security or compliance. Let's take a very basic example. Let's say you are in your school, university, or at the office. Any of these places, they have policy in place, that is, to enter your school, university, or your office, you need to wear identity card. Now that is nothing but a policy that your organization has, or a rule that your organization has for the purpose of security. Similarly, in the world of IT, in the world of software development lifecycle, policies are put in place to make sure your organization is secure and the infrastructure, resources, users in your organizations are subjected to compliance. Can we take an example to understand? For sure. Let's say you have a AWS account. Within the AWS account, you might have multiple S3 buckets. Now, as a DevOps engineer, using infrastructure as code, you might have created these S3 buckets. After a while of creation of this S3 buckets, there is a policy that is introduced in your organization, a compliance that is introduced in your organization, that every S3 bucket in your organization should have versioning enabled. Now, some of the S3 buckets might be created by DevOps engineers using infrastructure as code. Some might be created by developers. Some might be created for test engineers to store their artifacts. A policy is introduced which says any of such S3 buckets, doesn't matter who has created, versioning has to be enabled, or public, the S3 bucket should not be public, or there might be any policies introduced in your organization. Also, something like every EC2 instance must have an instance profile attached with a specific policy, or every IAM user must have access to a particular resource. So these are different kinds of policies that can be introduced in your organizations, either for the purpose of security or for the purpose of compliance. Now the question is, why are they very important? Okay, we understood what exactly is a policy, and in terms of software development lifecycle, what are these policies? Now if you talk about why are they very important? Now whenever we talk about security or we talk about compliance, by default, these are very important for your organization. Let's say in your organization, developers have permissions to create S3 bucket. And one of the developer creates S3 bucket, stores very important information in the S3 bucket. It can be the application logs or it can be any artifacts, and keeps this S3 bucket public. So this is a point of concern because the developer has put an S3 bucket public, which has important information of your organization, which is compromising security. So for such reasons, every organization will have policies, and it is important to implement these policies. Now the problem is that to implement these policies, like if there is only one S3 bucket in the example that we have taken, or if you're talking about IAM users, or if you're talking about EC2 instance profile, if there is only one EC2 instance or one IAM user or one S3 bucket, it's very easy to implement these policies, update these policies, or if required, to remove these policies. But quite obviously, in an organization, you will have hundreds of S3 buckets, hundreds of EC2 instances, and hundreds of IAM users. So how would you make sure a policy that is implemented is applied to all the resources? So for that, there is a concept called policy as code. So in policy as code, what we do is programmatically, as a DevOps engineer or as a DevSecOps engineer, we programmatically update the policies so that it reflects to all the resources that is target for the policy as code implementation. If you want to apply a specific policy to all the S3 buckets, as a DevOps engineer, either we can use programming languages like Python. If you're talking about AWS, you all know there is a Python module called Boto3. So you can write a Python program which will update all the S3 buckets with the required policy. Or you can also use YAML files. If your organization is not very, or your DevOps team is not very well versed with Python, so you can also use something like YAML and use tools like Ansible. So in this video, we will learn how to implement policy as code using Ansible. Ansible is a very powerful option for implementing policy as code because of the capabilities that Ansible can bring. One is it's very simple. You can write this in YAML files. It's not difficult if your organization is not well versed with programming. And other qualities of Ansible, like the idempotency nature of Ansible, which we discussed in the previous classes, or the configuration management, where Ansible can talk to multiple resources, or if you're talking about AWS, Ansible can directly talk to the APIs of AWS and interact with all the AWS resources. Along with that, if you want to understand the use cases of policy as code and how Ansible can bring the advantages in implementing policy as code, you can also go to this GitHub repository. So we are doing Ansible Zero to Hero series, which is a 14 episode series. Till now, we have completed 9 episodes and today is the 10th episode. So you will find all the required notes. What exactly is policy as code? How does policy as code help the organization? And how Ansible can work in the policy as code approach. Now we will proceed and we will try to implement policy as code. So we are going to do a demonstration. We will use the same use case, but towards the end, I will also give you some challenge, or I will give you an assignment. I will show an example with S3 bucket. Whatever we discussed, how to implement versioning on all the S3 buckets. We will learn this using Ansible, and you will also get an assignment towards the end of this video so that you can practice policy as code. So let's get started with that. So firstly, we will use our Visual Studio Code for that. So this is the Visual Studio Code. Let me create a folder called day10. Don't worry, you also have the code available. So if you go to the day10 folder and if you look at install and setup, you will learn how to first do all the required things, the prerequisites, what are required for Ansible to interact with AWS. We will also do that in the demonstration. But if you want to practice, you can use this GitHub repository. While I'm explaining, you can also refer to this and you can implement at your end. And there is another file, which is the actual playbook, which will implement the bucket versioning on our AWS account. First thing that you need to have is an AWS account. So I already have an AWS account. And if you go to Amazon S3 and click on the bucket section, we have 3 buckets here. So these are the buckets for the organization Gilliam, where they have a megametrics bucket, they have a middleware logging bucket, and they have logging information of the payment application. So this is for the Gilliam X organization. You can create buckets for example organization or any of your dummy buckets. First things first, you need to have your local machine or your personal laptop, wherever you are writing the Ansible playbook. That machine should have access to your AWS account. So for that, what you need to do, first, you need to go to the security credentials. Towards the right side, you have this drop down. Click on security credentials. Click on in the security credentials, you will find, if you scroll down, a section called access keys. If you want to do it with IAM user, you should first create an IAM user, grant it permissions with respect to the S3 bucket, and then you need to generate access keys for that IAM user. I am using the root account because I will anyways delete these access keys after this demonstration. So I have these 2 access keys, and once you generate an access key, you need to copy the information and go to your local machine. If you are using Visual Studio Code, take the terminal of it and simply run AWS configure command. How to generate the access keys? Very simple. Right now, I have 2 access keys. If I delete one of these access key, let me show you. If there is any beginner, it will help them. So first, I have deleted the access key. Now what I'll do is create access key. I understand creating a root key is not the best practice, but what I want to do is, for the purpose of demonstration, let me use the root instead of creating a new IAM user. But if you want, create a new IAM user. If you are doing this in your organization, it is must and should that you create an IAM user, grant it permissions with S3 bucket, because the playbook that we are going to do is talking to the S3 buckets, and then use the same approach to generate the keys. Copy the access key, run the AWS configure command. First, it is asking for access key ID, paste it. Then it will ask for the secret key. Let me pause the video here because secret is a sensitive information. Then you simply press on the enter and your AWS is configured. How can you verify that? So once you create S3 buckets, Okay. For this video, first you need to create S3 buckets. Just create S3 bucket with all the default options. You don't have to provide anything. For example, create bucket. Just provide the name of the bucket. You can call it as Abhishek demo policy as code, something like this, and just scroll down, create a bucket, because we just want to understand how to implement policy as code, nothing more than that. So you don't have to populate any content inside it. You can verify by running this command AWS S3 ls. Now, when you run this command, it should list out all the S3 buckets in your organization, in your AWS organization. So, okay, it explains that these are the three S3 buckets, and I already have them. When I type AWS S3 ls, that means I have my AWS configured. So step one was to create S3 buckets, which I have. Step two was to configure AWS on the Ansible control machine where Ansible is running. Perfect. I also have that. Now let's look at this S3 bucket. If you go to the properties, you can see that the bucket versioning is disabled. And you got a requirement from your management that as a DevOps engineering team, implement policy as code for all the S3 buckets. So what you are going to do is, as a DevOps engineer, you will write a Ansible playbook. In this case, passwordless authentication is not a prerequisite for Ansible. I have explained this in the previous classes as well. Only if your Ansible playbook is talking to the virtual machines or the servers, you need to set up passwordless authentication with that. But when Ansible is talking to AWS or network appliances or any resources other than the servers, then you don't need to implement passwordless authentication, because the Ansible playbook that you are writing, it will talk to the API of AWS, in specific case, the S3 API, and implement things on the S3 API. If at all your Ansible playbook was talking to a virtual machine or a server, what it would do, the Ansible playbook that you are writing, it will SSH to your EC2 instance, install the module that you are writing in the playbook, and execute that module on the EC2 instance. That's why passwordless authentication is required in the later case. Going back to our policy as code concept. So we will write Ansible playbook now, which will talk to the API of S3 and it will implement the things. So the prerequisite here, another prerequisite is to install Boto3. Why? You have provided Ansible playbook with your AWS credentials. That is fine. But to make an API call with that credentials, Ansible will use a Python module called Boto3. So first you need to have Python installed on that machine. Along with that, you also need to have Boto3 installed. Again, don't worry. All these things is mentioned in this install and setup documentation. So if you think that, Abhishek is explaining, I'm finding it difficult to catch, you can also refer to the notes where I have explained step by step what is required. So if you already have Python installed on your local machine, you can simply run pip install Boto3. I already have Boto3 installed, and I'm pretty sure if you are watching our previous Ansible videos, you would already have pip installed and also Boto3 installed. Okay, we have completed Boto3 installation as well. We have done 3 steps. We have created S3 buckets. We have configured AWS locally, and we have also installed Boto3. Final prerequisite is to install Ansible AWS collection. Now this is required because by default, when you are using Ansible installation will have all the Ansible inbuilt modules. But if you want modules related to AWS, modules related to Azure, F5, Cisco, Palo Alto, you need to install their collection. If you want to understand what is collection, what is module, please watch our previous videos where I have explained very clearly module, collection, playbook, task, and everything. Okay, so Ansible Galaxy collection install perfect. It says it is already installed, so I don't have to worry. Now, finally, we can proceed with writing the playbook. I'm not using the setup vault thing because it is only required if you want to secure your AWS credentials in the vault. For this video, it's not required because it will directly use the credentials from your AWS configure. Okay, now let's go to the date and folder. Let's create the playbook file. Let me call it as s3 underscore versioning.yaml. We should always start with 3 hyphens, and let's provide name for this playbook. Enforce S3 bucket versioning on AWS. Of course, S3 is on AWS. I have GitHub Copilot. That's why it is giving up with some suggestions. But let's ignore the suggestions and write it by our own. Host, localhost. As I told you, you don't need passwordless authentication. Ansible can run on the same control node. And let us disable the gather facts as well. False, because I don't want to gather the facts as part of this particular playbook. Let me start with the tasks. So the first task, Abhishek, how will I know what task should I write first? So I want to implement policy as code on all the S3 buckets. So what I will do is I will write this in 2 steps. Step 1 is list all the S3 buckets. Okay, I will list all the S3 buckets and I will store this in an array. In step 2, what I'm going to do is I will write a loop on the array that we have created in step 1. And what I'm going to do in the loop is I will take each item from the loop, and on each item, I will enable versioning. Very simple, right? Step 1 is to list all the S3 buckets where you will get 10, 15, 20 S3 bucket names in your organization. Just store each of them into an array. And in the step 2, loop over that array, and every item that you get from the loop, just make sure versioning is enabled. So the first step, list S3 buckets in AWS account. So Abhishek, again, how do I do that? Very simple. If you don't know, go to the Ansible AWS documentation. Ansible has very good documentation. If you go to Ansible AWS and simply search for S3. So you got S3 bucket module, manage S3 bucket in AWS. Then you have S3 bucket info module, which says list S3 bucket in AWS. Exactly what I want. Take this. If you scroll down, you will also get the example code. If you have GitHub Copilot like me, you don't even need this documentation. But okay, let's get this particular thing. So it says list all S3 bucket and register the S3 buckets, all the S3 buckets into the result, a variable called result. Okay, sounds good. Let's try to copy this information. Where is my VS Code? Perfect. So what I'm going to do here is I will just paste this. So why do you have Amazon.aws S3 bucket info? Because it's an AWS collection. You have installed the AWS collection. So that's why you have Amazon.aws.s3 bucket info. And what I'm doing, I am registering this to an output called result. You can also print this to just verify. Okay, what I'm going to do is I will debug and just see if I am writing step 1 correct or not. Okay, for now I haven't written step 2 because I just want to verify my playbook till this point is correct or not. So let me run Ansible playbook followed by S3 underscore versioning day 10 S3 underscore versioning dot YAML. Okay, list S3 buckets and perfect. It got all the buckets within result. Okay, within result, which is our variable, there is an object called buckets, and within the buckets we have all the buckets. So simply I can also say register results. I can also say result dot buckets, but I think this is also fine if we have a result as a variable. And when we loop over this particular thing, we should not be looping over the complete result variable. We can only loop on the result dot buckets, right? So I can simply say result dot buckets. Now let's do that. Here I am going to do name, which is my next step. Enable versioning on the S3 bucket. Enable versioning on. See, GitHub Copilot is already giving me the code on the result.bucket. Just have the versioning enabled. Perfect. So let me use that. So what I'm going to do is let me use loop instead of that. Give a space. Versioning loop. Perfect. So enable versioning on S3 bucket. I'm not looping on the result because if you see result as an object is not an array. Inside result you have bucket. Bucket is an array. So that's why I am looping on results dot buckets where I have 3 buckets. So within the buckets we want the name of the bucket. So that's why it is item dot name. Understand it carefully. It's a simple code, but if you are new to programming, you might get confused. That's why I'm trying to repeat it. We have registered a variable that is result. So we are storing the output of bucket info into a variable called result. The output of result is this entire thing. But what I want to get end of the day is the buckets. Buckets is an array, and within that array, you have item 1, item 2, and item 3. Element 1, element 2, and element 3. So this particular code that you are writing will loop over 3 items and it will get executed 3 times. But as per the S3 bucket syntax, it will need the exact name of your bucket to enable versioning on that particular bucket. How can you get the name? In this particular array, when you loop over each element, so you will get buckets dot 0, something like that. So it is buckets dot name, so that you can retrieve the exact name of the bucket. That's why I have item dot name. If I want creation date, it will be item dot creation date. Perfect. So now let's run this code. Before that, let me show you one more time that the buckets versioning is disabled. mega matrix Gilliam X bucket versioning is disabled. Now, if I simply execute this, okay, there is some error. Let's try to fix it. Localhost item valid booleans include 0, y1 on false. What is it exactly trying to do? Okay, versioning is of type false. Okay. So what does it say is when I set this value versioning as enabled, it says that the value for the versioning can be only of yes or F or true or T. So let me just say versioning as yes. Let me try one more time. Okay. It is executing enable versioning. It has changed mega matrix Gilliam. Now it will try to change middleware. Then it will also try to change the payment app logs. You can see OK3 changed one. So let's try to see if the mega matrix Gilliam bucket, the bucket versioning is enabled or not. Okay, bucket versioning is enabled. Then let's go to another bucket as well, middleware bucket. Let's see the properties, enabled. Finally, let's go to our last bucket so that we can verify Ansible has updated all of your S3 buckets with respect to the required policy of your organization. Perfect. So this is how you implement policy as code. Of course, you can do it with Python. You can do it with Terraform. You can do it with a lot of other tools. But personally, I would prefer Ansible for this task. So this is the video for today. I'm also going to give you an assignment. Try to implement policy as code on your EC2 instances, or try to attach policies to your IAM users. If you want to do with EC2 instance, what you can simply do is create two EC2 instances using policy as code, attach a policy.json or a policy as an instance profile to your EC2 instances. If you want to do it with IAM users, same thing. Try to attach a policy for your IAM users in your organization. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. See you all in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.